Welcome to Solutions for Higher Education, a podcast by Scott L. Wyatt, president of Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah. To subscribe to this podcast, please visit www.suu.edu/President's Podcast, where you will find both the audio and a written transcript for today's podcast. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Solutions for Higher Education, a podcast featuring Scott L. Wyatt, the president of Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah. I'm your host, Steve Meredith, and I'm joined in studio today, as I almost always am, by President Wyatt. Scott, it's a beautiful summer day in Cedar City.
Yeah, it's a nice day. It's the kind of day we should sit outside under a tree and read a book. It's
hard to do a podcast when you're doing that, but yes, it is. It's that kind of day, and you're right. And this is a great sitting under a tree book. The book we're going to talk about today, part of our summer book series, and I'm just have been fascinated with this book, and really, my wife will verify that I have been wrapped up in reading this late into the evenings and early mornings, and just literally anytime I can find time, I've really enjoyed reading this. Anyway, why don't you introduce the author of our book?
So we are delighted to be joined today from Louisiana, John M. Barry, the author of The Great Influenza. John, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And it's a pretty nice day in New Orleans right now. It rained pretty hard earlier.
I was first introduced to your book by Dr. Blodgett, who is our public health director for our region of the state. And we're friends, and every once in a while he gives me a book. And he brought your book by maybe 2 years ago and said, if you like that one here, you'd really like this one. So that was my introduction to your book, and what a fascinating book, and what a relevant, interesting period of history for us to talk about today.
Unfortunately, too relevant.
Unfortunately, that's right. What brought you into this topic? How did you get into the topic to write this book? What motivated you?
Well, oddly enough, I never intended to. My earlier book, Rising Tide, there's a chapter in there largely about the home front, World War I, and events in 1919, one of the most interesting years in American history. And I intended to write a book on that. And of course, the pandemic was part of that, but I ended up getting diverted and spent 7 years on this book. I have always been interested in science. When I was a kid, the only two things I ever wanted to do was write and do medical research. So, and I had written an earlier book, which gave me a pretty good scientific grounding on immunology with Dr. Stephen Rosenberg, who pioneered immunotherapy for cancer and also did the first human gene therapy experiments. So I had the background there, and the pandemic had always interested me. As I say, it became the entire book.
Yeah, the Great Influenza. You chose a title for the book that's probably better than the Spanish flu.
Yeah. Well, I've never been good at titles. When I wrote for magazines and several other books, I have never once, well, I won't say never, but probably in hundreds of magazine stories and a handful of books, I probably picked the title 3 times. but that's counting The Great Influenza. But nobody could come up with a better one. So it is.
Yeah, it's a good title, and Spanish flu is what we call it, but of course it didn't originate in Spain.
No. As you know, you read the book, Spain was not at war, did not censor its press. All the European countries with the warring countries, did censor their press. Didn't want to write anything negative. The U.S. did not formally censor its press, but it did have a lot of self-censorship and some laws that were very tough. And Spain, when it hit Spain, and plus the king of Spain got sick, so celebrity culture gets a lot of publicity. It got picked up the name Spanish flu, but not in Spain. In Spain, they called it the Naples flu. But we do know, as you said, it didn't start in Spain. It may actually have started in the United States. That's what I thought when I wrote the book. Although originally it came out in 2004, there's been a lot of scientific research since then, and I now think that it's probably most likely that it started in China, although it could still have started in the United States. I thought it was in a rural part of Kansas, Haskell County. There are other hypotheses. There's some very good virologists think it started in France.
Yeah.
Some other people think Vietnam. Another possibility is New York City. We'll probably never know. But not Spain. We do know it didn't start in Spain.
Didn't start in Spain. I have a brother that lives in Kansas, and I said, do you know where the Spanish flu started? And he says, well, Kansas.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So at least he was in the right, he was out of the wrong country, at least.
That's right.
Yeah, these things are...
Well, I actually wrote a scientific journal article about the site of origin. I thought they made a pretty good case and got a reasonable amount of traction in the scientific community for that hypothesis. Although, as I said a moment ago, I personally have now backed away from it. I think the evidence is better for somewhere else, but it still may have been in Kansas.
You've mentioned the press, and it might be fun for us. We're assuming that our listeners have read the book, so in theory, but we know that some of them will have not finished the book, and this will hopefully motivate them to finish it or get it and read it. But if it's okay, let's talk about some of the parallels and differences from 1918-19 till now. And you've raised one interesting topic, and that is the press. So in 1918, we were fighting World War I, and the country that wasn't stifling public speech was Spain, and they got branded with this because of that. What parallels do you see or differences from 1918 and to 2020?
Well, in 1918, there was fake news, without a doubt. But the reason it was fake was because they were repeating what the government wanted them to say, which was a lot of misleading information and in some cases outright lies. That wasn't exactly for political interest, or at least not self-interest. That was because of the war. The government, you've got to remember, from Wilson's perspective, the largest demographic group in the country were Germans. He wasn't really confident that those of German descent would go to war against Germany enthusiastically. Another very large demographic were Irish, and Ireland rebelled in 1916 against Britain. So you weren't sure if the Irish would fight on the side of Britain. And they created a propaganda arm called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee said that there's nothing in experience that tells us truth is superior to falsehood. All that matters is the inspirational value. So that kind of thinking informed this committee, which would issue not just press releases. They had a force of several 100,000 people in a country of 108 million, 107 million, something like that, who would go to every public meeting, whether it was a vaudeville show or a school board meeting, and give a brief, they would call it 4-minute men, and they would give a brief inspirational piece of information every day. And it was always had to be positive, put the most positive spin on the news. Meanwhile, and that was sort of the carrot, there was also a stick. The Congress passed a law that made it illegal, 20 years in jail, to, quote, utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, unquote. And even a congressman was sentenced to 10 years in jail under this law. So it was actually quite rigorously enforced and turned against newspapers when they criticized things if they dared. Notice in there it didn't say anything about truth being a defense. That law, strangely enough, was upheld by the Supreme Court. Not only was it upheld, but the person who wrote that opinion was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's well known as a champion of free speech. But in his decision are two phrases that it sort of lived on. One, he used the analogy of shouting fire in a crowded theater, and the other was clear and present danger. So here you have a propaganda arm going out and putting the best possible light and sometimes using outright lies about what's going on to keep the public propped up. And then you threaten anybody that if they criticize anything that's going on, they might be subject to prosecution. The Justice Department, without any legal authority, gave out 100,000 badges to something called the American Protective League. And they, again, no legal authority, but they would spy on people, their neighbors, and even their families sometimes. It was really quite a nasty, nasty situation. So that was the context in which the pandemic arrived in, sort of an infrastructure. And to prevent any negative interpretation of what was going on, you had national public health leaders saying things like, this is ordinary influenza by another name, Spanish flu. But it wasn't ordinary influenza by another name. It was much, much more virulent, much more lethal than COVID-19. People could die in less than 24 hours. They could die with horrific symptoms, such as in Army camps where the data is good. Some camps, 15% of the soldiers had nosebleed. But more frightening than that was people could bleed from their eyes and ears, which would be pretty terrifying for a layperson and not exactly reassuring for a healthcare professional. So people are dying in large numbers.
Quickly.
They're dying with, some of them quickly, but most, that was unusual, but it certainly happened in less than 24 hours. Many of them with very, very strange symptoms. Everybody knew this was not ordinary influenza by another name. So they knew they were being lied to. And that led to a fraying of society. I think society is based on trust. Trust disintegrated. It became every person, every family for themselves in the worst situations. That didn't happen everywhere, but that was the worst case. Unfortunately, the worst case, or close to the worst case, was common enough that in the book I quoted Victor Vaughn, who is a sober, serious scientist who had been the dean of the University of Michigan Medical School before the war and was a colonel, head of communicable diseases for the Army during the war. And right at the pandemic's peak, he wrote, if this continues its current rate of acceleration for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. That's how bad it looked like it could get in the worst case. Just at about the time that he was writing that, things improved. So we didn't go down that road. But it was a horrific experience. You didn't have anybody calling it a hoax. in 1918. You didn't have anybody doubting how serious it was in 1918. Today, of course, unfortunately, you have sort of a split administration, a split government. You've got the public health professionals who are trying to take this seriously from the very beginning, and you've got the political operation that sees the pandemic almost as a personal attack on the president. The virus doesn't care who's in charge, and it is serious and it is real. And the response out of Washington has been frankly incomprehensible. And other countries, practically every other developed country, has handled it much better than the United States has when we had more resources than anybody else.
When in 1918? So in 1918, the communication from government started out with, this is just the flu, don't worry about it, life's fine. And as you mentioned, inspiration was one of the keys, and if somebody disagrees with them, they get punished. At what point did that change? Because the inspirational value goes away as soon as you realize that you're not being told the truth.
Yeah, probably early October, the Surgeon Generals. Well, the first wave. There was a first wave, but the first wave was. I think the virus wasn't very good at that point in adapting to people, and it was very spotty. For example, Los Angeles didn't have a single death from influenza in the spring of 1918, not one. I think most of the country did not experience a first wave, and most of the world didn't either, although it was pretty widespread in Western Europe. So that wave was really spotty. It's quite different from COVID-19, where it spread rapidly around the world. Obviously, we have airplanes now; it can spread in hours. Didn't have that back then. But I think the virus probably did mutate and become better at infecting people. And that second wave was widespread, largely simultaneous around the world, and beginning. Well, if the pandemic, you could say, lasted, some people think 2 years, some people 3 years, but probably close to 2/3 of the deaths occurred in a period of about 14 or 15 weeks in the fall of 1918. So even though technically it was spread out, there was really this incredibly compressed time frame when most of the people died and most of the action was. And that was the second wave. There was a third wave, which is very unusual. The third wave began in late winter, 1918, 1919. So like maybe early March, 1919. So you had two influenza waves in the same winter. That is extraordinarily unusual. And what happened was the virus mutated again, so that it became different enough that you didn't have any natural immune protection. The first and second waves, even though I just said it mutated and became better at infecting people, it was close enough in those two waves that if you were infected in the first wave, you were protected in the second wave. In fact, your level of protection, and I did write a peer-reviewed scientific journal article on this, along with some co-authors from the National Institutes of Health. You actually had better protection than any vaccine we've ever developed for influenza. So those two viruses they were the same virus, but it changed enough for the third wave that neither first nor second wave exposure protected you against the third wave. And then again, there was more in the 1919, 1920 influenza season than partly because people's immune systems had seen the virus and they were better able to deal with it, and partly because the virus continued to mutate, seems to have gotten more mild. it became seasonal influenza. And that virus actually continued to circulate and was the seasonal influenza virus, or descendants of it. Again, it mutates regularly, very rapidly, so it would have changed significantly, but until 1957. COVID-19 is a different situation. From the very beginning, it's been very, very good at infecting people. I'm sure your listeners by now all have heard of a reproductive number of a little over 2.
Right.
Well, that compares to seasonal influenza is about 1.2. The 1918 virus was about 1.8. And this is, 2.2. And that may not sound like, or 2.3, somewhere in that neighborhood for COVID-19. That may not sound like a big difference, but it's a huge difference. It's much, much more contagious than influenza is. Even at a reproductive number of 1.1, 1.2, that's enough for seasonal influenza to infect, 10% of the population, 15% of the population any given year. So you double that, and you're talking about the epidemiologists and modelers early on, and this seems to have been borne out. If left to its own devices, if there had been no interventions, no lockdowns, the virus would infect 60 to 80% of the world's population. That's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
The 1918 virus infected about a third of the world's population. Some places more, some places less. And we also, but we did intervene. So we haven't really, we stopped the first wave by interrupting transmission with the lockdowns in many places around the world, most places. And therefore, we still have a huge percentage of the population, well over 90% in the United States, probably about 95%, who are susceptible to the virus. Which is why, if we are not careful as we come out of lockdown, it's still out there, and it will continue to infect people and could potentially explode. The great irony of this is that we have figured out how to keep it in its box, not stop it entirely, not eradicate it, but keep it tamped down. It's up to us to do it. We can succeed in this without locking down the economy, but we all have to play our part. And the most important thing, by far, is social distancing. And then comes, masks and hand washing and staying home if you have the slightest symptom. Those 4 things, if we had pretty much everybody doing it, we would have, we would definitely take the top off this thing, and people could function pretty normally, and the economy could come back without much of its problem. If we don't do it, we can, I'm sitting here in New Orleans, I don't think about waves, I think about hurricane storm surges, a big one.
One of the, when you're talking about the economy and social distancing and masks and everything, one of the interesting comparisons or points of comparison between 1918 and 2020 is the sense to which people are complaining about their civil liberties. And we have a variety of people in the country and, saying things like, you're going to take away our civil liberties here, 2020, and we'll probably never get them back. But when we look at the history of 1918, interestingly enough, Cedar City, where our university is, relatively small community, it wasn't the federal government or the state that was imposing the restrictions, it was the city. And it was against the law with criminal penalties to go out on the streets for 4 weeks in October, November, that range, without a mask on. And anyway, it's interesting to compare the extent to which people were complaining about the economic issues and the civil liberties issues.
That is interesting. A lot of places did that. I'm not familiar with what happened where you are. Not every city, but by any stretch, made it mandatory. A lot of them did, particularly as you move further toward the West Coast.
Right.
And social distancing. So I was just this morning, I was listening to a press conference from the governor of Louisiana, and he was making the point that instead of worrying about what your rights are and thinking you have a right not to wear a mask, you should be thinking about doing the right thing. And I think that's a good way of putting it. Asymptomatic people and people who are about to get sick but haven't shown symptoms yet, which would be technically pre-symptomatic people, they do spread the disease. So you can feel completely well and shed virus and infect other people and spread the disease to your coworkers, to your friends, to your family. So-called comorbidity, something that increases risk, is just obesity. Not to mention things like high blood pressure. It's not clear yet, but it's quite possible that pregnancy becomes a high-risk situation. That certainly was in 1918. I mean, these are different viruses, but pregnancy puts an additional burden on the body. And in 1918, that was probably the highest risk group. The range of studies of pregnancy found the case mortality ranged from 21% to 71% of pregnant women. Now, we don't know that that's anything like the case COVID-19, but, pregnancy could be a high risk. So if you're going around risking exposing co-workers, friends, and families by not wearing a mask, and the mask does protect you as well to a much more limited extent. The reason it protects other people more than it protects you is because it catches, the larger, if you not just cough, but even speak, then droplets escape from your mouth, and the mask will catch them. And that's the primary mode of spread. The mask will protect you from droplets. It won't really protect you from really tiny airborne viruses that float in the air. But it will protect you from against droplets as well.
John, another interesting comparative point between then and now is the 1918 version of this flu virus seemed to kill people across a wide range of ages, and seemed even maybe especially acute among the young, who seemed that they could be immune because they just were in the very prime of their lives and at their greatest physical strength, and yet, as you say, they could, even the very healthiest specimens could be dead in a very, very short time. And that was shocking to many people. In fact, I think out of your book there's a quote about it was almost like watching, because so many young people died, it was like watching them die twice. They'd lost their lives, but they'd also lost their youth. It wasn't at the end of their lives.
Very prominent physician scientist said that they were doubly dead and that they died so young. That was very unusual for influenza. Fortunately, not the case for COVID-19. Normally, influenza kills the very old and the very young. and it certainly killed the very young in 1918. In fact, it killed children under the age of 5 at a rate that, if you compared it to today, it would equal all-cause mortality for a period of 23 years. So imagine the number of kids under age 5 who die from every cause: drowning, car accidents, cancer, over a 23-year period, compressed into a few weeks, dying in 1918. Think of the impact on parents. But most of the deaths, probably 2/3 of the total, were people aged 18 to 45. And the peak age of death was about 28. And again, very unusual, and obviously, not the case with COVID-19.
I was visiting the cemeteries. It's one of those things that some of us do for Memorial Day, and it had never occurred to me, but in looking at the gravestones of my wife and I, our ancestors, we each have a great uncle or aunt that died in October of 1918, and they were both in that age group that you described, in their 20s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just causes us to say, oh my goodness, that's really interesting that we have 2 members of our family that died then. One was in the infantry but never left the country. The other one wasn't.
Okay. Well, yeah, it was not a great time.
One of the things I love about this book is how painstakingly researched it is, and how you're able to weave a just multiple thread narrative that kind of wanders through the beginning of modern American medicine and Johns Hopkins University, and the beginning of epidemiology and bacteriology, and through the politics of Woodrow Wilson, and anyway, it's been a fascinating read. As I look at some of the names that come through here, you talk about Rockefeller, William Welch, and a number of other characters that kind of help drive the narrative of this book. Who do you think are going to be when whoever it is that's the John Barry that 100 years from now writes the book about the 2019-2020 flu? Who do you think will be the personalities? Obviously, Donald Trump will be one, for good or for ill. Who do you think we'll remember out of this time?
Well, it's a little bit too early. In the book, I did focus on the scientists who tried to confront and made incredible progress. And they were great scientists. Give you a sense of how good they were. The Nobel Prize, you don't get that unless the committee knows that you're correct. They won't give it to someone who's with a controversial finding. There was one character in the book who won the Nobel Prize in 1966 for work he actually did in 1911. He was 55 years ahead of the curve.
This is what's interesting about it. In reading your book and seeing what's going on today, it's one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing is comparing then to now, and then projecting forward and thinking, how will we respond for the next one of these? Until your book, John, I had assumed that this was really a World War I veteran circulation thing. But it's interesting to learn that all the places where this 1918 influenza started, without the influence of anybody from World War I, these Inuit villages and small places in Africa and even maybe New York City or other places. Talk to us about that.
Well, I mean, the virus gets everywhere. This is COVID-19 is, very likely to get where you are, even though you're certainly not a big city. And, there were villages in Alaska as well as in the middle of the jungle in Africa where there was 100% mortality, 100%. Now, that probably wasn't because of the virus per se, but if everybody gets sick at the same time, no one can even give out somebody else water or food. So, plus the psychological impact of everybody around you dying. So, I mean, it's insidious and did get everywhere, except for a few very isolated places that shut themselves off. Gunnison, Colorado managed to do that. You couldn't get off a train in Gunnison, and they barricaded the roads. There was an island in the Pacific that did that, and a few places like that. But the virus, it may have taken a little bit longer to get there. But the people think in 1918 the world was much more primitive than today, and of course it was. But as the death toll indicates, it was also much more connected than we probably would otherwise think, because that virus did go everywhere. Yeah, the death toll is estimated at between 50 and 100 million people in a much smaller population. If you adjust for population, that would be equal to 220 to 440 million people today. And obviously we didn't have good statistics back then, which is why that death toll is given in a range, a pretty big range. But it got everywhere, as this virus will.
The range you're talking about is the size of the United States.
Right, that's worldwide, of course. Inside the U.S., we have decent statistics for about 2/3 of the country. About 1/3 of the country did not have good statistics, but it's probably about 675,000 Americans who died, which would be equivalent to roughly 2 million today, which is actually a pretty good outcome in terms of if you compare that to the rest of the world.
What do you think is going to be our biggest takeaway from this pandemic?
Well, it remains to be seen. Either something utterly bungled or something where the citizens of the United States rallied to the cause and took charge of the illness by acting responsibly. I don't know which it will be. It's too early. We intervened and stopped the first wave. So there really wasn't a first wave, but that does leave, as I said earlier, probably about 95% of the population susceptible to the virus. We will see. If we do everything right, we're going to see, we came out of lockdown. It's not possible to prevent upticks. You are going to get upticks, but they can be controllable. Even without drugs, and of course we still have no drugs that can, you have one, but it's in short supply, remdesivir. Hopefully there'll be a lot more drugs coming soon, and remdesivir helps, but it's not a magic potion. But even without drugs, we have learned a lot about how to care for people. For example, there were, if you have a certain level of oxygenation of the blood, but the standard of care is you put someone on a ventilator when their blood isn't carrying a lot of oxygen. But we've learned that that's not the right thing to do in many cases. We're learning about all sorts of other ways to treat people that gives them a better chance of surviving So even without the drugs. So we're improving almost on a daily basis. We're learning more about clinical care. So if we can keep the hospitals and the intensive care beds from being overrun, we can lower the case fatality rate. The most important number coming out of China, in my view, was that the case fatality rate in Wuhan was 5.8%, and the rest of China was 0.7%. And the difference was that the healthcare system in China was overwhelmed, and the rest of China wasn't. So they had intensive care unit beds in the rest of China, and they didn't have any in Wuhan. And similarly, in Italy, they ran out of intensive care beds, and they were completely overwhelmed. We didn't have that situation anywhere in the United States, although we came very, very close to it in New York and, for that matter, in Louisiana, where I am, right on the edge of that. But we managed to stay on the right side of the edge.
Yeah, we kept the beds so free in our neck of the woods that they laid off a lot of nurses and healthcare workers. Which was kind of an interesting side to it. And I asked you what will be the takeaways, what we'll remember from the 2020 pandemic. And it's never fair to ask a historian to
predict the future.
It's always easier to predict the past. But what a very fascinating period of time.
Then and now.
True.
Yeah. What have we not asked you that you think is particularly relevant? This book of yours, this topic, what a fascinating topic. Others have written books about the Great Influenza, but I think that yours is regarded still as the very best book. And we recommend it to our listeners.
Well, thank you. You're very wise.
Well, thanks for joining us today.
Okay.
It would be fun to talk again in a year or 2 years after we know more about the pandemic that we're in.
It would be fun to follow up with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And good luck this fall opening your university. And when are you opening, incidentally?
So our first day of classes are right after Labor Day.
Okay.
So the first.
I know some schools have actually decided to change their schedules a little bit, open in August and take off earlier when it gets colder. But
we're like some other states. Utah is exploring the possibility of starting at the same time, but then not bringing students back after Thanksgiving and just moving to remote for the last week or so. So we'll see whether we
need to have that.
Yeah.
We'll know a lot more in a few more months.
Yeah. One of our challenges is that we have a pretty good summer school, and so it's hard to. If we didn't have summer school, it would be much easier to move the start of fall.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, well, thank you so much, John.
You're welcome. It's been fun. Take care.
You've been listening to Solutions for Higher Education, a podcast featuring Scott Wyatt, the president of Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah. We've had as our guest today John M. Berry, and we've discussed his book, The Great Influenza. John is a New York Times best-selling author. We highly recommend this book. It's fascinating, it's painstakingly researched, and really an interesting read. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. John joined us by phone from his home in the French Quarter in beautiful New Orleans, Louisiana, and we thank him for joining us, and we thank you, our listeners, for joining us. We'll be back again soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Solutions for Higher Education. To subscribe to this podcast, please visit www.suu.edu/President's Podcast, where you will find both the audio and a written transcript of today's podcast. The original music for this podcast was composed by Jack Barton, a master's degree student in music technology at SUU. For more information about Southern Utah University, please visit www.suu.edu.